Week 1 came, it conquered, it left us with heartbreak, and it left us with a lot of excitement and joy. That's why we play the game of fantasy football. And now, like the snap of Thanos' finger, we are moving right into week 2 of 2024 fantasy football. You know what we're going to do. We're going to go through every single matchup, every single relevant running back in the NFL, talk about why you need to start them or sit them in week 2 of 2024 fantasy football. And before we do so, let me remind you guys that Underdog is the place that you want to be this season if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. All of their week 2 pick'ems will be going live as the week continues to progress. And if you guys want to claim a free pick'em, Josh Allen over half of a total yard before Thursday night football, you can claim that free pick'em with promo code DCatch. That link is down below. If you guys are watching this video after Thursday, don't worry, you will still get a free pick'em going into Sunday's action as well. And on top of that, you are going to get a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. That's up to $1,000 in bonus cash you can use on Underdog. Pair any pick'em you want with that free Josh Allen pick'em heading into Thursday night football. Automatically double your cash. With that, let's hop into our starts and sits at the running back position for week 2 of 2024 fantasy football. All right, let's kick things off with Thursday night's matchup between the Bills and the Dolphins. And James Cook, one of my favorite starts in week 1 against the Arizona Cardinals, finished with 13 fantasy points, 71 yards on the ground, added 3 receptions for 32 total receiving yards. But Josh Allen is a bad man, and he likes to vulture rushing touchdowns, as he had 2 rushing touchdowns in this game. Listen, I still like James Cook throughout the whole season. These opportunities will be there for him. He's a clear-cut RB1 on this team, but we do have to admit that Josh Allen is probably going to take away most of the upside from James Cook, but he'll still have his moments. He'll still score touchdowns throughout the season. He's still a good start. It's just the ceiling's kind of lowered because Josh Allen is an absolute animal when he's within the 20-yard line. Ray Davis was a good watch in week 1, but just ended up with 3 total rushing attempts and 1 reception, 3.7 fantasy points. He's a sit. Ty Johnson had 2 rushing attempts, but he also got a little bit banged up with a knee injury and only had, didn't even have a full fantasy point. So Ty Johnson, we're not even considering moving into week 2. Moving along to the Dolphins. Let's start with Devon Achane, who had 10 total touches in this game, and then he added 7 receptions off of 7 targets. So we already know what we're doing with Devon Achane on a week in, week out basis. He is a must-start player. The upside is way too high. We're starting Devon Achane no matter what. Now, I liked Raheem Mostert a lot going into week 1. I still thought he would be heavily involved. I expected a little bit more fireworks while there were still some in that matchup between the Jaguars and Dolphins. And right now, I am staying away from Raheem Mostert like he is the Grinch. 6 rushing attempts, 3 targets, 3.9 fantasy points. I'm not going to give up on Raheem Mostert. Definitely not going to drop him or anything, but we need a consistent pattern to emerge. We don't want to overreact to week 1. I still think he's going to be part of this offense, but man, not putting him anywhere near my starting lineup until we see something emerge. Jeff Wilson had 5 touches in this game. I did not like seeing that, but he might be something, I don't know, a touch stealer from Raheem Mostert, if anything, but 2.6 fantasy points. We're not starting Jeff Wilson anywhere soon. And then on the other hand, we do have Jalen Wright, but he was inactive for week 1. They went into this matchup with Achane, Mostert, and Jeff Wilson, and that was it. So Jalen Wright, maybe still a guy we're holding on to because of the talent and could be a potential handcuff, but for now, he's not going to be anywhere near any starting lineups moving into week 2. All right, moving along to Sunday. Let's talk about the Niners facing off against the Minnesota Vikings. And at the time of recording this, Monday Night Football has not been played. So I don't even know if Christian McCaffrey is going to play, but I think he probably will, and he'll probably be just fine. And As long as Christian McCaffrey is healthy and active, it doesn't really matter. We are starting him week in, week out. We all know that. And on the other hand, here, looking at the Vikings, Aaron Jones, a player that I really encourage you guys to start last week against the Giants. He came through 18.9 fantasy points, a touchdown, 94 yards on the ground, 6.7 yards per catch, and added 2 catches for 15 receiving yards. Still like him in week 2. I think for the most part, if you drafted Aaron Jones, you're probably starting him based on draft capital, but he's kind of an if you need to start him, I think you definitely can, but he's going up against this 49ers defense. I don't know if Sam Darnold is going to be as stout against the Niners as he was against the Giants in week 1. I still think Aaron Jones is fine, don't get me wrong, but maybe you have another option or you ended up drafting Jones as your RB3 that you feel like you can bench him this week. I'm also okay with that, but he's just kind of Ty Chandler came in with 8 touches, 3 receptions, not bad, 7.2 fantasy points, but I don't know if he'll be as involved in a more stout matchup against the Niners. So for me, he's a sit. Plus, it's not like we're going out of our way to start Ty Chandler with 7.2 fantasy points in week 1 anyway. So Jones, okay if you need him. C-Mac, we know we're starting him. Let's move right along. All right, let's take a look at the Seahawks traveling to face the New England Patriots. Now, I do think the defenses will both play well in this game, and more than likely, I don't expect a lot out of Geno Smith and Jacoby Brissett, so I don't really feel too excited about these offenses. But at the same time, with Geno and the Brisket, probably not going to play that well. I think both offenses will really rely on the run game here, and I do like both starting running backs for both teams this week. And Kenneth Walker, a player that I heavily encourage you guys to start going into week 1. He was one of my favorite players going into week 1. I did have a touchdown called back, so worth noting that his 18.9 fantasy point performance could have had an even higher ceiling. But at the end of the day, we're happy with 103 yards on the ground, a touchdown, and 2 total receptions. He's probably just going to be a must-start player until further notice. It is worth noting that Zach Charbonnet had 8 touches on the ground, 3 total targets, and walked away with 12.1 fantasy points because he had a receiving touchdown. So Zach Charbonnet, who I felt was a lower end handcuff going into the season and going into week 1, maybe we continue to see more involvement, but you take away that receiving touchdown, then the thesis was completely right, and there's really nothing here from a fantasy standpoint. So keep an eye on Zach Charbonnet, but for now, he's nothing but a watch player, and he's going to be a sit moving into week 2. Ramondre Stevenson, heavily relied on in week 1, came away with a touchdown, 21 fantasy points, ended up with 3 additional targets and receptions on top of 120 rushing yards, So big day for Ramondre Stevenson. I think that the Patriots will continue to rely on him going into week 2. We had Ramondre as a start in week 1. Still like Ramondre as a start in week 2 for sure. Antonio Gibson had 7 touches, 18 rushing yards, but was really inefficient, 2.5 yards per carry. 1.8 fantasy points. He's going to continue to be a sit, but Walker, Stevenson, both solid starts moving into week 2. All right, let's take a look at the Giants traveling to face the Washington Commanders. And yeah, I'm just going to stay away from most Giants offensive players for now, including the running back position. Devin Singletary, 9.2 fantasy points. If he had found the end zone, I think, he would have been fine. I kind of liked him going into week 1, but just nothing offensively was happening for the Giants. He walked away with 10 touches, 37 yards on the ground, did add 4 receptions. So still in a really, really, really deep format, if you're forced to start Devin Singletary as your RB2 in a 16-man league, probably okay. This Washington Commanders, our defense was really bad week 1, but for the most part, I'm just going to sit Devin Singletary, Tyrone Tracy, Eric Gray, stay away from all these Giants running backs. Don't think majority of you guys need to start any of them in week 2. Brian Robinson Jr. looked really good in week 1, 17.9 fantasy points. This Cliff Kingsbury offense was very kind to Brian Robinson. We knew that they were going to try and run the football. We saw that utilized in the preseason. 40 yards off of 12 rushing attempts, a touchdown, added 3 receptions. Overall, a good day for Brian Robinson Jr. Does look like Jaden Daniels is going to be vulturing some touchdowns from these Commanders running backs, but at the end of the day, B-Rob I still think is going to be solid week in and week out. Austin Eckler did walk away with 10 fantasy points, but he had just 2 rushing attempts, 10 total rushing yards. He just came up in the pass game, 4 targets, 4 receptions, 52 receiving yards. I think maybe Eckler could be okay in a deep format, once again, just because it's the Giants defense. But at the end of the day, I just want to see this pattern emerge here. Make sure that this is really going to be a thing where he's going to get enough PPR work or pass catching work that he's relevant in PPR formats. But just the amount of carries makes me uncomfortable. Jaden Daniels at the goal line, all that stuff. B-Rob looked really sharp. So I'm just going to stay away from Eckler for now. But I will say, guys, against this Giants defense, I really like Brian Robinson moving into the week. He's going to be a player that I talk a lot about throughout the week. So he's definitely a start, even though everyone else in this matchup comes up as a sit as we approach week 2. All right, let's move along to the Chargers traveling to face the Panthers. And this was honestly, like, looking at both these running back rooms, these are probably the two most frustrating running back rooms moving into week 1 for me, or coming out of week 1 for me, because I expected a lot more out of the Gus Bus in that matchup against the Raiders, and he was awful. 11 touches, 2.3 yards per carry, 26 yards on the ground, 1 added reception, 3.8 fantasy points. I'm very worried about the Gus Bus, a guy who I drafted a lot of, and as the week went on, I talked about this a lot in the live streams. Like, I started early, like, yeah, Gus Bus is a great opportunity, great matchup. But then as the week went on, I started talking a lot about J.K. Dobbins. Like, I think J.K. Dobbins might really be the running back in this matchup. I was watching his lines for anytime touchdown score, on different sports books, and as the week went on, his line continued to get worse and worse in terms of moving down. And then Gus Edwards started to get, higher and higher in terms of a positive line. And it really seemed like Vegas really liked Dobbins going into the week. And that turned out to be the right call. He had 22 fantasy points, 10 rushing attempts, 135 yards on the ground, 13.5 yards per catch. A tutty, added 3 total receptions. He also had the longest play of the entire day in that week 1 matchup with a 61-yard run that was almost turned into a second touchdown. At times, he looked a little bit sluggish still coming off the injury, but ultimately, I think for the most part, he looked like he's going to be a player we can trust when he is healthy and on the field. So this Panthers defense, especially their run defense, is bad. Really bad. Might be the worst run defense in the whole entire league throughout the season. So Dobbins, fire him up, throw him in your starting lineup. I do have a suspicion, not copium here, but I do have a suspicion that this is going to be a backfield that's frustrating at times this year. And maybe Gus Edwards eats a little bit in week 2 as well, especially against this poor of a defense. I mean, we saw Jamal Williams have a touchdown in week 1 against this Panthers defense. So I won't be surprised if Gus Edwards comes out with a decent stat line here. But for now, let's just follow the trend. We have a very small sample size. It's just week 1, but let's fire up J.K. Dobbins. I'm in on J.K. Dobbins moving into week 2. Now, Chuba Hubbard slapped us across the face. I thought the volume would be enough to get him through that week 1 matchup, but this Panthers offense looked like they were playing pee-wee football level out there, and the Saints defense just smacked them all over the place. So I don't know how to feel. Like, I think the Chargers defense is going to play well in week 2 against the Panthers. I don't know if Bryce Young is going to give this offense enough opportunity for these running backs. Chuba Hubbard, 6 touches, 1.4 fantasy points. Miles Sanders, 5 touches, 2.2 fantasy points. This is just a complete stay away offensive situation for the Carolina Panthers, basically at every position until further notice. Next up, we're going to talk about these Saints traveling to square off against the Dallas Cowboys. And Alvin Kamara, one of my favorite starts in week 1. Really encourage you guys to start him. He was on the must-start running back video. He's the number 1 player going up against that Panthers defense we just talked about. Thesis was true here. 22 fantasy points, 83 yards on the ground. A tutty. Was efficient on the ground as well. 5.5 yards per carry, and he had 5 targets, 5 receptions, everything we wanted to see out of Kamara in week 1, but it's a tougher matchup in week 2 going up against the Cowboys. I don't really care. Jerome Ford, even in garbage time, even if garbage time was most of his output, Jerome Ford still had a good week 1 against this defense. So I'm okay with Alvin Kamara. I think for the most part, too, where you drafted him, you're going to continue to start him. So I like him as a good, strong start once again in week 2. Jamal Williams walked away with 12 fantasy points, a touchdown, an added reception, 38 yards on the ground, but garbage time, the Saints were smacking around the Panthers like we've been talking about, so he's going to be a sit for me in week 2. If he gets involved enough in week 2, maybe we can start to consider him here and there, but I think it's going to be way too volatile, so staying away from Jamal Williams. Looking at volatility, let's take a look at the Cowboys running back room. And for some reason, I put Dalvin Cook on the screen. in case you're thinking about getting cute, but he was not even an active player in week 1. But I just want to remind you guys, apparently, that Dalvin Cook is on the Cowboys roster. But let's talk about the two primary guys here, Ezekiel Elliott and Rico Dowdle. So Zeke, crusty dusty Zeke, said, hey, I got some juice left in these legs. 10 rushing attempts, 40 total yards, 4 yards per catch. Like I said, the touchdown, had 2 added targets, 2 receptions. Decent day for Zeke. He hit that double-digit mark. He's just a start for me. If you have to start him, maybe he is the running back we want to own for the Cowboys. I thought it'd be Dowdle. Let's try and kind of wait for a consistent pattern to emerge. But if you're really desperate, I think Zeke's okay. But bear in mind, the Saints' run defense looked really good in week 1. Rico Dowdle did have 8 touches, just 2 less than Zeke, and did have a target, just 1 less than Zeke. I think it's going to be a really frustrating fantasy football running back room this year. I think it's going to depend on who stumbles on into the end zone. Maybe we see Dowdle in week 2. Maybe it is just Zeke. I don't know. I think for the most part, I'm avoiding these players. But if you want to keep the faith in Zeke, maybe it's going to work out and he's an okay start. Then Deuce Vaughn had 1 rushing attempt in this game. Hunter Lupick, I don't know how to say his name. He had 2 targets, 3.8 fantasy points. But I don't think we're going to be considering him either. And then, yeah, Dalvin Cook's on this roster somewhere, but we're not starting him. So for the most part, Alvin Kamara, strong start in week 2 in this matchup. Crusty Dusty Zeke, maybe he's got something left. We'll find out. All right, moving along to the Colts squaring off against the Malik Willis-led Packers. I think this is probably the easiest matchup to evaluate moving into week 2. Jonathan Taylor is going to be a must-start week in and week out. If I'm not mistaken, there was not a single running back on this roster other than Jonathan Taylor in week 1 who had a rushing attempt. It was all Jonathan. There's not even a handcuff on this Colts. I think the second highest rusher on a regular basis is going to be Anthony Richardson. And Anthony Richardson actually had more rushing yards than JT in week 1. So my mistake, 56 compared to 48. But yeah, this is as clear cut as it gets. I know the upside wasn't super high. The ceiling wasn't necessarily there in week 1. 10.8 fantasy points, a touchdown, 48 yards on the ground for JT. But he's still the RB1 here. You drafted him to be an RB1 more than likely on your roster. And Anthony Richardson was slinging the football around, which is encouraging to see. But I if that worries you, I wouldn't be too worried. JT is a week in, week out starter. And don't forget, this Green Bay Packers defense got torched by Saquon Barkley in week 1. So I think JT a very solid start in week 2. And moving along to the Packers, Josh Jacobs, even if Malik Willis is leading this offense, I think that helps Josh Jacobs. We're going to see them rely on the run game more. He had 16 rushing attempts in week 1, 84 yards on the ground, 3 targets, 2 receptions, had a fumble, didn't score, but he still got you double digits with 12.4 fantasy points. So, yeah, I just think Jacobs a week in, week out starter. There's not a lot to talk about. At the time I'm recording this, don't know if Marshawn Lloyd is going to suit up for week 2 or not. And Emmanuel Wilson did look good on the limited touches he had, 46 yards off of 4 rushing attempts, 11.5 yards per carry, 3 targets, 2 receptions, 6.8 fantasy points. So, I mean, he looked good, but we're not going to consider Emmanuel Wilson or Marshawn Lloyd. They are pure handcuff plays for your roster. So, pretty straightforward. Start JT, start Josh Jacobs. Let's move along. All right, next up we have the Browns traveling to Jacksonville to face the Jaguars. And the Browns offense, I just don't know what to do here. Deshaun Watson looks like he might just walk away from the game of football and start a massage parlor business or something. I mean, he just looks so unmotivated out there. It's very worrisome. But at the end of the day, I mean, this offense, even though they looked like a total mess, Jerome Ford, one of my favorite starts going into week 1 at the running back position at 18.9 fantasy points, 44 yards on the ground, a tutty. Nice to see 7 targets, 6 receptions in the passing game as well. Don't know if they'll really be playing, from behind maybe against the Jaguars in week 2, but then again, they could very well be. Nonetheless, Jerome Ford, the volume is there. That was my argument going into week 1 all week long. Pierre Strong had 2 rushing attempts. Donta Foreman was only on the field for 1% of snaps, had 0 total rushing attempts. Naheem Hines is on the PUP list. And then if you're not aware, Nick Chubb is also on the PUP list. So it's all Jerome Ford here. He's still a must start on a week in, week out basis until that changes. The Browns need to utilize the run game, and it was very nice once again to see him involved in the passing game. So Jerome Ford continues to be a start week in and week out. Moving along, we've got the Jaguars backfield, which I think is very interesting to look at here. And some of you guys I know out there are panicking on Travis Etienne, which is fair. But I think he's going to continue to be a start week in and week out. He did fumble near the goal line. That was bad, not good. 12 rushing attempts, a touchdown, 44 yards on the ground at the end of the day for Etienne. So, I mean, I expected more out of this Jaguars offense in week one. They were one of the more disappointing teams for me, but double digits. I think ETN is still going to be a must start until further notice. But yeah, definitely worth noting that Tank Bigsby tied him for total touches on the ground with 12 and looked really solid. I mean, 6.8 yards per carry for Tank Bigsby, 73 yards on the ground, 7.3 fantasy points. So if he starts to vulture some touchdowns, he's going to be a player who's going to make Travis Etienne's fantasy output really concerning. But let's not overreact too much to week one. Let's kind of see that come to formation if it's truly going to. Bigsby, a solid waiver addition going into week two. Definitely worth stashing. Definitely a good handcuff. But for now, I'm going to start Etienne and sit Bigsby until we see something that's overly concerning. All right, let's move along to the Jets squaring off against the Tennessee Titans. And once again, as a reminder, at the time I'm recording this, Monday Night Football is not gone underway yet, has not been played. So I have not seen the Niners and Jets game, but I expect Breece Hall to be a player, really, no matter what, that we are starting on a week in, week out basis, regardless of matchup, regardless of the previous week. So Breece Hall, he's still going to be a start against the Titans in week two. And then Braylon Allen, probably going to continue to be a sit. I'm going to expect most of the volume to go to Breece Hall on Monday night. And I mean, really, outside of a Breece Hall injury, there's nothing to talk about here. We're starting Breece Hall no matter what. Now, moving along to the Titans backfield, a little bit more interesting here. Tony Pollard really looked like the RB1 in this backfield, and then Tajay Spears really looked like the RB2. And this was a pretty competitive game script for the Titans, where they needed to stay in the game, and they were continuously trying to do so. Really just kind of back and forth messy game for both offenses, but Tony Pollard really shined in terms of fantasy for the Titans offense. 18 fantasy points, scored a touchdown, 82 yards on the ground, 5.1 yards per carry, then added 3 receptions off of 4 targets. So not a great matchup for the Titans in week two going against this Jets defense, but I still like Tony Pollard a lot. Jets defense last year was not very good against the run, so I think Tony Pollard a really solid start moving into week two. Tajay Spears, on the other hand, had 7.2 fantasy points, was involved in the passing game like we wanted to see, 4 targets, 4 receptions, but that tied Tony Pollard's target mark there. And then 21 yards on the ground, still efficient on the ground, though, 5.2 yards per carry. So I don't love Tajay Spears. I put him in the category. I don't think he's necessarily a sit, but I don't necessarily think he's a start. If you're in deep enough formats, he might give you a safe enough floor. And if we start to see him score some touchdowns, I still think he's going to be fine as a RB2 and fringe situations. But I think for the most part, I just want to focus on Tony Pollard until further notice. I do like Tony Pollard moving into week two. And yes, regardless of what happens in Monday Night Football, unless we see a game ending, season ending, week two ending injury for Breece Hall, we're starting Breece Hall no matter what. All right, next up, one of my favorite matchups of week two, we have the Tampa Bay Buccaneers traveling to face the Detroit Lions. And where are my Rashad haters at? Yeah, that's right. I'm still drafting Rashad White all over the place, or I was drafting Rashad White all over the place heading into 2024. And I begged you guys to start him in week one. I don't know why people were worried about Rashad White in week one, or why they were worried about Rashad White ever. I mean, yeah, maybe because of Bucky Irving, who we'll talk about in a second. Maybe because the efficiency is not great. Still had 2.07 yards per carry, but Rashad White's my boy. Looks so good in the passing game with the ball in his hands. 6 targets, 6 receptions, 75 receiving yards, 12.5 yards per catch. No, he didn't score a touchdown. I was still disappointed kind of with this Rashad White performance because I expected him to score a touchdown against that Washington Commanders defense, but who cares? He walked away with 16 fantasy points. They're going to get him the football. The Buccaneers offense looked great in week one, a much tougher matchup against the Lions run defense in week two. But Rashad White, just one of these unique players who doesn't have to be good with the ball in his hands in the running game because he makes up for it in the passing game. He's a great, viable PPR option on a week in, week out basis. You're still starting him as an RB2 for sure moving into week two. Bucky Irving, elephant in the room, 6.89 yards per carry, 62 yards on the ground. Also got a little bit involved in the passing game with 3 targets, 2 receptions. I mean, I will note, and this is not copium, I will note that the Buccaneers, they got some guys like Bucky Irving, Jalen McMillan involved throughout this game against a really bad Washington Commanders defense. I don't quite know if we'll see as much of that against the Lions in week 2, but Bucky Irving, a great handcuff. I could definitely see him get more utilized as the season goes on. He did look very good with the ball in his hands. I think this could be a really interesting 1-2 punch maybe as the season goes on, but ultimately for now, I'm keeping my faith in my boy Rachaad White. But keep an eye on Bucky Irving. We're definitely going to keep a close eye on him and see how things continue to emerge there. Then moving along to the Lions here, Gibbs, Monty. Like I said last week, you're just starting both these guys no matter what. I mean, maybe you have enough running back depth where Monty's on your bench, but it's like, I even said it last week, like, you're probably just going to want to start Monty week in and week out. This is going to look similar to last year. I mean, and it really did in week 1 against the Rams. Gibbs had 17 fantasy points. He had a touchdown, 40 yards on the ground, 6 targets, 4 receptions, more PPR upside, scored a touchdown, double-digit fantasy points. Monty, on the other hand, better on the ground, 5.3 yards per carry, 91 yards on the ground, just 1 reception, but he did score that game-winning touchdown, 16 fantasy points, and Monty just came in towards the end of this game. This is what works so well for the Lions is they can rest Monty when they want to, they can spell Gibbs when they want to, and Monty can come in there basically fresh, take over a game, and just say the Lions are going to win this football game. Sorry about it. He was dominating the Rams at the end of this game. Both running backs here for the Lions are solid fantasy options moving into week 2. All right, next up, we've got the Raiders traveling to Baltimore to face the Baltimore Ravens. So I don't know why I did the intro like that, but nonetheless, we're going to look at Zamir White and Alexander Mattison for the Raiders here. And yeah, I just am not willing to start either of these players. They were the only running backs on the Raiders who got any touches in this game. I expected a lot more out of Zamir White in week 1, but with the noodle arm, Gardner Minshew slinging the football out there, this Raiders offense just did not look good in week 1. And Zamir White, I don't want to panic on him. If you went 0 RB and you had the faith, I think we still keep the faith here in Zamir White. He still out-touched Alexander Mattison by 8 touches, 13 rushing attempts. Still had 2 targets in the passing game and 2 receptions. So absolutely bad week 1 performance, 4.6 fantasy points, but I don't want to give up on him. He's got some intriguing matchups in coming weeks, Carolina and Cleveland in weeks 3 and 4, then the Broncos in week 5. So not going to give up on Zamir White, but here against the Ravens, who, still allowed a fair amount of fantasy points to Isaiah Pacheco in week 1. I expect them to play better against the Raiders than they did against the Chiefs in week 1, though. So I'm going to sit Zamir White for now. I think most of you guys don't need to start him. I know I really liked him going into week 1. I got to sit back and see what happens here. Now, Alexander Mattison, I have as a sit as well. I don't know if I want to trust Alexander Mattison, but he did have 6 targets and 4 receptions, 43 receiving yards, and he scored that touchdown off of one of those receptions, and then 5 rushing attempts, just 3.8 yards per carry, 19 total rushing yards. But he came away with 16 fantasy points, but I don't want to get too cute here. Like, does anyone really need to start Alexander Mattison? Maybe you're going to pick him up off the waiver wire and see what happens here. But I just don't know if I want to overreact to a week 1 receiving touchdown by Alexander Mattison, essentially on a broken play. So I'm not going to start White or Mattison, not against this Ravens defense, who I do expect to play better in week 2. They're both going to be sits for me. Now, Derrick Henry, if you're panicking, don't panic on Derrick Henry. He still scored a touchdown. He was still used how the Ravens want to use him. People were saying like Henry's washed. He looked slow, looked bad in this game. So it was a tough matchup. I think people really underestimate how good that Chiefs defense is. And I expect Derrick Henry to be just fine as the season goes on. I expect him to be much better against teams throughout the season, like the Raiders, who, gave up essentially 2 touchdowns to J.K. Dobbins last week, but at least 1 touchdown and a huge rushing day for for J.K. Dobbins in week 1. So Henry will be fine. Maybe the ceiling's limited. Yeah, I know Lamar Jackson ran for a whopping 102 total rushing yards. I know Justice Hill was heavily involved in week 1 as well, but don't panic on Derrick Henry. He's going to be fine. You're still starting him. Now, talking about Justice Hill, you take away the receiving work here, and he did nothing. He had 1 rushing attempt. So the game script really benefited Justice Hill. I don't know if this game script against the Raiders is going to benefit Justice Hill. So I think it's a little bit risky to start him in week 2. If you're in a situation where you feel like you want to, move him into RB2, I think he's okay, but I think there's risk involved here. I mean, 8 targets, 6 receptions, 52 receiving yards in week 1. Even if he just did half of that, it'd be a much, much poor fantasy stat line. But I think what I liked seeing out of Justice Hill is that Lamar Jackson was looking for him heavily in this game. And they seem to have good chemistry, and Lamar wanted to dump the football off to him. But I think once again, when you go back and you look at that week 1 performance, Chris Jones was getting all the way through that offensive line on a regular basis, which was leading to Lamar Jackson needing to dump the football off or run the football himself. Plus, the Chiefs did a very, very good job of taking Mark Andrews out of week 1's performance, our offensive game plan, obviously. So I don't know if all these things are going to translate into week 2. So I think he's a risky start, but maybe you're in a bad enough position where you feel like you need to start Justice Hill. I still think he's intriguing, but definitely some risk as we approach week 2. All right, moving along, we got the Rams traveling to face the Cardinals, and I think they're going to have a very good offensive day. Even if Puka Nacua doesn't play, we saw that this Cardinals defense is going to continue to be very, very allowing to opposing fantasy offenses, and specifically against opposing running backs and or runners of the football, guys like Josh Allen, right? But when we look at the Rams offense in week 1, for anyone worried about Kyren Williams, he had 18 touches, was on the field for 91% of snaps, and added 3 receptions off of 3 targets. Blake Corum had 0 touches. Ronnie Rivers came out of nowhere, maybe not out of nowhere, but he had 2 rushing attempts. Other than that, it was the Kyren Williams show. He found the end zone, got a touchdown, 14.4 fantasy points. We're starting Kyren Williams on a week in, week out basis. He's going to get absolutely fed in the Sean McVay system. They're going to run him into the ground. Blake Corum is going to continue to be a pure handcuff who we are not starting. On the other hand, while I encourage you guys to not panic on Kyren Williams, maybe I did not encourage you guys to draft enough of James Conner. He comes in with 19.3 fantasy points in week 1, scored a touchdown, had 50 total yards on the ground, looked good out there, had 4 targets, 3 total receptions. So if you own James Conner, you're reaping the benefits of getting a workhorse running back late in drafts for another season, which is exactly what you wanted. So start James Conner until further notice. The Rams defense did not look like they knew how to defend the run in week 1, albeit that was Gibbs and Monty, but let's give Conner some credit. He is still an absolute must start in week 2. Trey Benson, just 3 touches, 1 target in week 1. We're sitting him. Mario DeMarcado, 2 targets, 2 receptions. We are sitting him coming off of 4.6 fantasy points. Then DJ Dallas did have a touchdown in the return game, but saw 0 snaps, 0 rushing attempts in terms of the actual offense. So shout out to DJ Dallas, who had 6 fantasy points, but he's not going to be a player who we're starting anytime soon. All right, moving along to the Bengals facing off against the Kansas City Chiefs. This should be a good matchup. I expect the Bengals to play better in week 2. Let's hope that they do. Zach Moss was still a player that I encourage you guys to start in week 1. Basically, throughout the entire week, I was pretty high on Zach Moss. Not a super high ceiling, but he had 14 fantasy points, had a touchdown, 44 yards on the ground, 4 targets, 2 receptions. Good day if you started Zach Moss, but the ceiling was limited and a bad offensive performance overall for the Bengals. Some people like Chase Brown going into week 2 because we didn't know if Chase was going to play. We knew Higgins was probably not going to play. It was a mess. Maybe he would get more work in the receiving game, but for me, it was Zach Moss throughout the week, and Chase Brown walked away just 5.3 fantasy points, only 3 total targets, 3 receptions. So Chase Brown going to continue to be a sit for me. This is one of those things that looked really promising in the offseason. The theory made sense, but until we see it, come true in the regular season, we can't afford to start Chase Brown in fantasy lineups. On the other hand, my boy Isaiah Pacheco, one of my most drafted players in all of fantasy, last year. And once again, this year came out of the week 1 performance against the Ravens with 15 fantasy points, a touchdown, 45 yards on the ground, 2 added receptions. We know what Pacheco is. We know we're starting him on a week in, week out. He's going to be solid once again in week 2 against a Bengals defense that did not look good against the run in week 1 against Ramondre Stevenson and the Patriots. Samaje Perine, 2 fantasy points. He's a sit. Carson Steele, 0.3 fantasy points. He's a sit. Let's move along. Isaiah Pacheco, Zach Moss, still both solid starts in week 2. Next up, we've got the Steelers facing the Broncos. So we are going to get Justin Fields at quarterback and Bo Nix at quarterback. What exactly does that mean for these backfields? Well, we'll find out. And I guess I should say Russell Wilson could very well end up starting for the Steelers, but I think they're just going to stick with Justin Fields. Recording this on Monday, so I guess we'll find out. But I mean, Fields had 57 total rushing yards. Does that take away from the Steelers running backs? Probably to a degree, but I had both Steelers running backs just kind of like starts moving into week 1. I didn't really encourage you guys to start them. Didn't really feel good about them. I know the Falcons were disappointing offensively, but they still played pretty good defensively. I don't know. I just don't feel good about Najee going into the week, but he did get, Jalen Warren coming off that hamstring injury. So maybe that's part of the equation here. But Najee was the true workhorse running back in Sunday's action, but he didn't score a touchdown. The offensive ceiling's low here because the offense as a whole has no real ceiling. Better matchup in week 2 against the Broncos. I don't know, but the Broncos still had moments defensively in week 1. So Najee, you have to start him. You're relying on him as an RB2. I think he's okay. 70 yards on the ground, a reception, 8.9 fantasy points. I just don't like this situation. Jalen Warren had just 4 fantasy points. I hope he didn't end up starting him. I don't think he's just going to be a sit until further notice for me. Now, moving along to the Broncos, I honestly expected more out of this backfield. I didn't really encourage you guys to start any of the Broncos running backs in week 1, but looking on paper, the Seahawks run defense was really poor last year. But I don't know, like if you need to start Javonte Williams, he's okay. I mean, the Steelers defense looked really good in week 1, but they still allowed a double-digit performance to Bijan Robinson. But we're going to compare Bijan Robinson to Javonte Williams. I don't think so. Javonte had 3.3 fantasy points in week 1, 23 yards on the ground, 2 targets, 1 reception for 0 yards, like 2.8 yards per carry. I like Javonte as a late round running back going into the season, but I'm a little scared when he's got Pittsburgh, Tampa Bay, and the Jets in the coming weeks. So he's a start and more of a desperate RB2 start. Jaleel McLaughlin was the guy who got involved in the passing game and still had 10 touches on the ground, walked away with 5.8 fantasy points. When we're comparing the running back room, he might be the guy to have or to go grab off the waivers, but I just don't know here. I don't want to really start any of these guys. You could argue Jaleel McLaughlin should be in the category and Javonte should be in the sit category. I don't know. I mean, McLaughlin had 5 receptions for 1 yard. Let's just stay away from this situation. Audric Estime had 2 rushing attempts, 1.4 fantasy points. Worth noting that Bo Nix showed that he does like to run the football, 35 total rushing yards, scored a rushing touchdown in basically garbage time, at least made the game close to the end of the game. But, I think for the most part, we're going to stay away from the Broncos running backs this week against the Steelers defense. But maybe in a deep enough format, you could consider Javonte or I guess McLaughlin. But for the most part, I don't like this matchup for running backs. Let's just move along. All right, next up, we got the Bears traveling to face the Texans on Sunday night. And I expected more out of DeAndre Swift in week 1. So all you DeAndre Swift haters, get in the comments. Go ahead and crucify me. He did not have a good game. Okay, but the Bears also did not have a good game as a whole. Not enough offensive ceiling here. All that preseason hype is kind of going down the drain. We're going to have to really see Caleb Williams and company prove it. I still think DeAndre Swift is okay if you're forced to start him. He gets the category. And yeah, you guys know, those of you who know that I'm a DeAndre Swift guy, you're just going to say, well, John, you just always say to start DeAndre Swift, and he sucked butt in week 1 with 5 fantasy points, but he at least had the most overall volume and touches in week 1, and by a long shot. I mean, 8 more touches than any other running back on the Bears offense. So at least the volume's there. This should be a good competitive game script. It's going to really be up to Caleb Williams and how this offense performs as a whole in week 2 and as the next coming weeks come. Swift, I still think the running back to start. Khalil Herbert, just 2 rushing attempts, no passing work. Travis Homer, 2 rushing attempts, no passing work. We saw Blasingame get on the field for 13% of snaps, but not a single touch on the ground or through the air. DeAndre Swift, 1 target. So my theory about him still having PPR upside in this matchup, I guess compared to the other running backs was true, but overall was not good. So yeah, Swift, he sucked week 1. I get it. The Bears overall basically sucked week 1 except for their defense, but I think Swift, okay. You absolutely have to in week 2. Now, on the other hand, Joe Mixon absolutely freaking balled out in week 1, walked away with 26.8 fantasy points, 159 yards on the ground, 3 targets, 3 receptions, and he had a tutty. So if you own Joe Mixon, I think until further notice, we are starting him no matter what. Dameon Pierce is nothing but a handcuff. When we look at the rest of these Texans running backs, they're not doing nothing. They're feeding Joe Mixon. He had 30 rushing attempts in this game, and they are feeding those wide receivers. Mixon, as long as he's healthy, at this point, based off of week 1, definitely has top 10, arguably top 5 running back upside, just with how much, this Houston Texans offense is going to be in the red zone. I mean, Joe Mixon was the RB6 last year, believe it or not, the RB10 the year before that, the RB4 the year before that. Mixon's got to stay healthy. We look at the past 3 years, he's been pretty healthy. If you drafted Joe Mixon, you probably feel pretty good right now. Final game of week 2, Monday Night Football. We got the Falcons and the Eagles, the Dirty Birds matchup here. Everyone's going to be flapping around in this matchup, including the running backs. Bijan Robinson, a must start week in, week out. Falcons, bad week 1. Bijan Robinson, good week 1. 16 total fantasy points, 68 yards on the ground, 5 targets, 5 receptions, 43 receiving yards. At least they found a way to keep Bijan involved and involved enough to get us double-digit fantasy points, although I was expecting a tutty out of Bijan in week 1. Tyler Algier is nothing but a handcuff to Bijan Robinson. I still think he's a strong handcuff, but we're not starting him anytime soon. So Bijan Robinson, good at football. Keep him in your starting lineups. Then on the other hand, looking at the Eagles, we got another running back named Saquon Barkley, who I heavily encourage you guys to draft in the offseason. Don't know why I had to argue for Saquon Barkley, but I remember back in April and May when I was drafting Barkley, sometimes at the beginning of the 3rd round, aggressively as the offseason continued at the beginning of the 2nd round, and arguing that Saquon Barkley should be a end of 1st round draft pick, and people were calling me crazy and talking about the tush push and Barkley getting hurt. And don't get me wrong, some of those things may still factor into this season, but going off of week 1, I look very smart, and when I look smart, I like to remind you guys, as opposed to when I talk about players like DeAndre Swift maybe balling out in week 1. But Saquon Barkley, 33 fantasy points, 109 yards on the ground, 2 tutties on the ground, a tutty through the air, everything we wanted to see. I think it's a steeper matchup in week 2 against the Falcons. They looked pretty good defensively week 1, but we're not benching Barkley ever as long as he's healthy. Start him. He's good at football. Kenneth Gainwell, 2.2 fantasy points. Will Shipley only on the field for 5% of snaps in week 1. We're not starting Gainwell. We're not starting Shipley. This is a pretty easy matchup to evaluate going into week 2. That'll do it for today's video. There's every matchup, every single running back for week 2 of 2024 fantasy football. If you guys have any fantasy football questions, drop them in the comments down below. I will get back to every single comment, every single question on this video. Starts, sits, adds, drops, waivers, defenses, kickers, quarterbacks, wide receivers, running backs, tight ends, injury updates, roster reviews, whatever you guys need, any format, drop them down below. I promise I will get back to you before Thursday night's action and then before Sunday and Monday night's action as well. If you guys are new to the channel, if you enjoy the content today or find it helpful, hit that subscribe button on the way out. It means the world to me. And don't forget, as the week progresses, we will have everything that you guys need for week 2 of fantasy football, start-ems, sit-ems at every single position, trade videos, last-minute waiver wire videos, must-starts at running backs, and wide receivers who will dominate week 2 fantasy football, live streams, fantasy Q&A, whatever you guys need. I'll try to keep everything linked down below and on the playlist that you guys probably see on the screen at this point to help you guys get a dub in week 2. So make sure you guys check out all the videos for the week. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on the catch.